So, welcome to this seminar on the newly published EBA evaluation of Swedish Central Agencies Reform Cooperation in the Western Balkans. Welcome both to those of you who follow us live and to those who log on at your own convenience. My name is Magnus Lindell. I'm a member of the expert group for aid studies, and I have also a recent past with the Swedish National Audit Authority, where I was heavily involved in peer-to-peer cooperations in the Western Balkans and elsewhere. I guess that most of you listening have a fair idea what EBA is all about. But just to make sure that we are all on the same page, we will start with a short video introducing EBA and its mandate. It's all in Swedish, I'm afraid, but there are subtitles in English. So here you go.
Expertgruppen för biståndsanalys, EBA, är en statlig kommitté som oberoende analyserar och utvärderar svenskt internationellt bistånd för att det ska kunna förbättras och utvecklas. EBA har 10 ledamöter med kompetenser från olika biståndsområden och ett kansli som verkställer besluten. Förutom våra rapporter så ordnar vi seminarier, workshops och möten mellan olika parter. Varje år sammanfattar EBA sin verksamhet i årsberättelsen Biståndsanalys. Den kan beställas från kansliet eller laddas ner på eba.se. EBA har ett oberoende i relation till uppdragsgivaren regeringen, liksom i relation till vad som utvärderas, samt till de rapportförfattare som anlitas. Rapportförfattarna ansvarar själva för slutsatser och rekommendationer i sina studier. Allt vi producerar som rapporter, seminarier och vår podcast EBA-podden finns tillgängligt på vår hemsida.
There you go. We at EBA, we want to build bridges between politicians, researchers and practitioners. And this type of seminars has an important role to play in that regard, since it allows us to put our reports into a wider picture and to discuss them both from a policy and from a practical perspective. And that is also the ambition with today's seminar on this report, Institution Building in Practice, an evaluation of Swedish Central Authorities Reform Cooperation in the Western Balkans. The team leader for that evaluation, Richard Allen, will soon lead us through the main takeaways of the report. I will introduce Richard to you in a few minutes, but for now it will suffice to say that he is a seasoned international consultant based in Belgrade. After Richard's presentation, we will hear from 4 experts, each with a different perspective. We have Mo Hamza, professor at Lund University, Carmitel Cueva from SIDA. Then we have Stefan Andersson from Statistics Sweden, and finally Ulrik Westman, the Swedish Environment Protection Agency, and you will also be all introduced more properly in due course. After we've listened to the reflections from our panel, you will all be invited to take part in that discussion. You can do that by posing questions or a comment, which I will pass on to the panel, and we will use the Q&A function in Zoom, which we have found is more reliable in cases like this than the chat function. I will give you more instructions to that later. Now, before we move on, perhaps just a few words on why EBA commissioned this particular study. The role of well-functioning institutions in explaining why some countries are more successful than others has been extensively researched during the last decades. Indicators measuring the quality of government have been shown to have a clear positive impact on standard measures of development, such as infant mortality or life expectancy or child poverty. Swedish Development Cooperation has a long history of work aimed at strengthening the capacity of public administration of partner countries. In the early days, that was referred to as knowledge transfer or technical assistance. But nowadays, the term capacity development is primarily used. The difference is mainly a stronger focus on ownership and on conceptual adaptation. It is at the same time an open empirical question whether these factors and the change in terminology are accomplishing more, better, and sustainable results. In recent years, around 600 million Swedish kronor in development cooperation have been directed through Swedish government authorities. Some of the most active agencies include Statistics Sweden, the Swedish Mapping Cadastral Land Registration Authority, the Swedish Environment Protection Agency, the Swedish Tax Authority, and the Swedish Public Employment Service. The geographical area that recently has had the largest invested volume through these agencies is the Western Balkans, primarily Serbia, Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Kosovo. But there are only a few evaluations that have attempted to draw credible conclusions about long-term results in the development cooperation of Swedish government agency in a specific region of the world. And with this evaluation, we want to fill some of that gap and contribute to a wider discussion on how capacities can be developed and strengthened, and perhaps more importantly, how capacities can be put to productive use. Now it's time to let Richard Allen introduce the report and take us through the findings and the recommendations. Richard is a consultant. He's based in Belgrade, Serbia. He is an experienced evaluator working mainly in areas of capacity development and institution building, as well as aid effectiveness. He has worked extensively with bilateral donors, EU, and international organizations. Richard has an MA in Development Administration and Management from the University of Manchester. And to minimize the risk of technical embarrassments, we have pre-recorded Richard's presentations. So here we go.
Hello everyone. I just today wanted to give you a very brief overview of the research that we've done, that we're presenting today. I'm just going to give you the highlights of the main sections, but I know that we're going to have a bit of time later on, so if there's any questions you have later, we can pick up on some of the details. Very quickly, what we did was to look at the work of 10 projects, 5 government agencies in the Western Balkans, in 4 countries of the Western Balkans. So that's Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, and Albania. And the 5 agencies you can see on the screen. Looking at these 10, and there were 10 projects in total, 10 interventions, in fact, because some of them were lasted quite some time. In a few cases, more than 10 years, and there were sequential phases. We can characterize, I think, just to give you a summary of what those projects were about. We can characterize them in kind of the following ways on the next slide. The heart of the relationship, the heart of what the Swedish government authorities are doing is a peer-to-peer relationship between themselves and their expertise and their counterpart agencies in other countries, and in this case in the Western Balkans countries. So, you know, the statisticians, the statistics experts in Sweden work with the statistics agencies in Kosovo, in Bosnia, and they have this professional relationship where they learn from each other. That's the heart. Actually, what we saw in many of the interventions was that peer-to-peer relationship had expanded and moved on to some of the Swedish government authorities actually managing change, managing projects, or if not actually managing, then providing a great deal of additional support beyond that peer-to-peer educational relationship. We saw projects that were looking only at single partners, one agency in Bosnia, one agency in Kosovo, and the Swedish agency. And we saw projects, interventions that were looking across a whole system. We were looking, for example, one of the projects was the juvenile justice reform in Albania. So the Swedish police, along with other Swedish agencies, were working with counterpart agencies in social welfare, in police and justice, in penitentiaries, and so on, right across the justice system. And so you see these kind of broad system-wide interventions. Some of the interventions were short-term. Majority of them, in fact, were quite long-term. And by long-term, you know, one phase would be about 4 years. Often it's 2 phases, 8 years, 3 phases, 12 years, and so on. And that's I think, a key part of the relationship that Swedish government agencies have. And finally, you know, some of them were 8 of the interventions we looked at were country level. 2 of them were actually covering the whole region. So what did we see? What did we observe? Excuse me. We looked for change that we could reasonably consider for which there had been a contribution from the Swedish government authorities. And we looked for 3 kinds of change. We looked for capacity change, so change in the way that the organizations had changed, whether they had new strategies, or the leadership competences had changed, whether people in some way had learned something, were behaving differently, different values, whether there was systems change, and whether they were actually able to manage change, I think is a very interesting area that we looked at. And we did see, in most cases, we saw that the Swedish government agencies had influenced, had made a contribution to capacity change in the partner agencies they were working with. Just 2 examples. In the police, for example, in Serbia, the Swedish police had introduced and supported the introduction of intelligence-led policing as an approach, and that had been widely accepted and widely taken on. And so that was both a change in the people, because the police really took on this approach, but also a change in the system, a change in the way they worked. Excuse me. And then in Bosnia-Herzegovina, we saw that the statistics agency had trained and supported the statisticians in the 3 statistics agencies, and they were doing their work differently. They were producing better statistics, they were producing new statistical products, and they had an understanding of a more robust understanding of statistical methods. And that was clear. Now, the assumption was that we could then see, well, do the agencies that the Swedish government authorities are working with, have they actually improved what they do? Not just do they have the capacities, but have they actually improved what they do? We talked about, so we were looking for performance change. And there were a number of examples where there were indeed performance improvements of the partner agencies. In Kosovo, for example, the Ministry of Finance and Municipalities had introduced a system of tax collection, local tax collection, property taxes, and they were collecting revenues. So this is a new system. They had the capacity, but they were also collecting revenues, so they were performing better. Now, these revenues were being used at local level and being spent on small infrastructure. The amounts are not huge, but it was the start of a system. That was a good example of performance change. I think another example of a performance change is in Bosnia. The CILAP project with land reform had introduced a system to help municipalities register addresses. And we had a situation 10 years ago. The situation in Bosnia was that something like 40% of houses did not have proper street addresses, which meant great difficulties in posting letters, bills, deliveries, so on. It's a huge. It sounds a very simple thing, but it's a huge barrier to delivery of public services. With the CILAP intervention, most municipalities in Bosnia now have a way of recording addresses, and if you go to Sarajevo now or anywhere in Bosnia, you'll see that most of the houses do indeed now have numbers outside, and street names and addresses. It's a big change, and it's a huge. I think the impact is quite wide there. We see from that the individual agencies or the systems improve their performance. Now, the next question was then, did that lead to an improvement in the overall quality of governance? And we do see, it was hard for us to actually find evidence of that because there hasn't been much monitoring and evidence gathering. But we can see that the outcomes are likely in a number of cases. And the ones I've listed here, the property tax example I gave you in Kosovo, the amounts of the money are too small to be convincingly related to an improvement in government accountability, but it's there potentially for the future. And I think we also saw in with the street address example I gave you, there is definitely a likelihood, if I can say that public services, local public services particularly, have improved because of the street addresses. But actually having evidence of that is a bit harder. I think people can say that, and it's very likely that it's happened. It's harder to see. All right. That's in terms of impact. Let's move on to lessons learned. I'll briefly just run through a couple of these because I think there were a number of lessons learned and they relate quite closely to our conclusions and recommendations. But primarily, I think the things that make a difference to an intervention, the things that lead to successful interventions, are things like having a good, strong inception phase where you build a relationship. You really investigate what the real issues are, and you find solutions that are feasible and appropriate. And that takes time. It's not something you can knock off in a couple of months. It's not something that you respond to a list, a wish list, and say, okay, we can do that. It's something that requires trust. It requires openness, and where we saw inception periods of like a year that involved study tours, workshops and so on, we saw much better designs, project designs that were realistic and feasible. So that's critical. Success also depends on having, I think, this system approach, the system-wide view, understanding the interdependencies between institutions so that you can resolve those. Focusing only on one institution, one organization, we saw that restricted the ability of that organization to tackle some of its problems because it was dependent on others. Now, the statistics example is a good one where the Kosovo, for example, the Kosovo Statistics Agency depended on handwritten statistics from health centers, and they had to go and collect them by hand in order to compile them. And this was a major constraint on time and efficiency and reliability. And without dealing with the health system and the education system for providing that data, the statistics agency really couldn't improve its provision. So that's where system-wide approach works. In terms of implementation, we saw that the projects with core teams of civil servants and experts that worked together, that were driven by the leadership of the host of the partner agency, were more likely to deliver change and more likely to be sustainable than the examples where the Swedish agency was delivering training or delivering something without real engagement, active participation of the host, the partner agency. Embassy support is critical. It can help in the design, it can help in facilitating implementation, it can help in bringing a partnership together. And then obviously, one of the critical factors here is that a reform process is driven politically, that there is political commitment to that. So let's just quickly go to the conclusions, I think, from our research. The main conclusion, I think, is that the Swedish government agencies play a really distinctive role in Sweden's international development assistance. It's not something that can be replicated or duplicated by anyone else. That peer-to-peer relationship, that credibility that they bring in terms of their own particular expertise is something that is incredibly valuable, I think, in the toolbox, in the international development toolbox. However, they're facing constraints. The success is there. They need not just their own core skills, but they also need skills in development management. And that means relationship building, it means project management, it means understanding other countries, other contexts, political economy, so on. And that's something that needs to be further developed. The embassies really play a role there in making sure that the designs, that the priorities are selected correctly. I think the prioritization is really important. And that the right skills are brought together, that you can't just assume that a Swedish government agency, a Swedish government authority has the skills to be able to do everything. And I think the embassies play a critical role there. And what we're seeing actually is that the demand for the Swedish agencies is increasing, and the agencies are struggling now, the Swedish authorities are struggling now to provide a sufficiently high quality response to that demand. Which brings us to the recommendations. So what we're saying really is that the Swedish government authorities have a unique or a distinctive offer for international development. If they are to be able to deliver on that, they need to be able to invest in the future. And that means that in order to know what's needed, it needs to be integrated into the thinking of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and CEDA. So when they're thinking about their strategies, when CEDA is thinking about its strategy in terms of what its priorities are, what it's trying to deliver, it needs to think about what resources it's going to need from the Swedish government authorities to support the implementation of that strategy. And not just to see it as a call on resource, but to invest in those authorities, invest in building the capacities that they have in order that they can respond to the needs of the Swedish CEDA and Ministry of Foreign Affairs strategies for the future. And I think it's that working together and thinking about, how do we invest, how do we develop, is at the core of our recommendation. The other recommendations really deal with kind of, at the country level, how do the embassies play that role? They should play a more active role, raise the bar a little bit, bring in additional resources, and fundamentally, I think, prioritize. I think we also need from the Swedish government authorities, they need to also look at if they get a stronger core funding, and a lot of what they can do is dependent on core funding. They need those funding models. If they get those funding models, that they then have to invest in building the skills, capacities, procedures, tools, and so on, for playing a bigger role in international development. And I think that's kind of at the heart of what we're saying about the findings from the report and the recommendations. I'm looking forward to the discussion. I'm looking forward to your questions. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Richard. This was recorded a few days ago. Now you have now been listening to yourself. Do you get any cold feet? Is there anything you would like to withdraw or perhaps add or underline?
Hi, Magnus. Well, apart from how painful it is to watch yourself pre-recorded on video, I don't have much to add, I think, on that. I think I would say that it's hard to overstate the need for good capacity building of institutions. And you highlighted it in your presentation. I think the role of institutions in international development is so critical. And yet we still really don't have the answers. You know, it's still very much a mystery about how do you build capacity of institutions as an external agency working in another country. And I think what we've got from this research, I think, are some very, very interesting findings around, you know, the elements of interventions that make it possible. And the Swedish government agencies have demonstrated, I think, very much in practice, you know, what it looks like to design and deliver a very good international development, capacity development project that really does have an impact on not just on capacities, but on service delivery. We've learned a lot from this exercise, and I hope that through the next kind of the next part of this discussion, we can elaborate on some of those elements.
Okay, Richard. Yes, we are going to. I mean, the peer-to-peer cooperation will be the very essence of our discussion for the next hour or so. Now, it's time, I think, to let our experts and commentators have their say. And I will first introduce to you Professor Mo Hamza. He is professor at the Division of Risk Management and Societal Safety at the Lund University. His career is balanced between practical work with a variety of international humanitarian and aid agencies, and teaching, research, and managing academic programs at universities. Mo has worked with and advised, among others, the World Bank, Asia Development Bank, UNDP, USAID, DFID, SIDA, ActionAid, and the Swedish Red Cross. And I look forward, Mo, to hear your comments on this report. The word is yours, Mo.
Thank you very much, Magnus, and thank you for having me. It's been a privilege being on the reference group of this study, least of all because we had our own study at Lund University. It had a different scope and a different unit of analysis, and I'm going to use this as a basis to reflect on this EBA evaluation, possibly kind of reinforce and echo a lot of what Richard had said. Our study wasn't an evaluation, it was more of a sort of an appreciative inquiry. It was a co-creation process with Swedish government agencies and SIDA. And it was mostly kind of insights into the current thinking and approaches that Swedish government agencies use in capacity development in working internationally, what the factors that shape or enable or sort of constrain their thinking and practice, and what possible directions for them to provide more effective capacity development. So our unit of analysis was the Swedish agencies, with the focus on capacity development as sort of an important part of what they do, which kind of aligns with what this evaluation is on. We talked to each other, Richard's team and my team, and we've found quite a lot of synergies in terms of what our findings pointed to. A lot of what we sort of found echoes what Richard has said. We found that there is a common understanding of the key elements of what capacity development entails within Swedish government agencies. It's not a question of knowledge, it's not a question of what it is. But there is still a gap between what Swedish agencies think they should work on and what they actually do in practice. And I think the evaluation teased out a lot of the reasons sort of behind that. One of the most important of which I will just kind of throw in and allude to now, but we'll come to it in a much more detailed discussion afterwards, is the power structures under the surface of the partner organizations. These are not easy to read. Longer inception stages, as Richard said, helps with that. But there is a much, much bigger sort of overarching issue, and that's the social contract in the country itself, the position of these organizations within society, their legitimacy, etc. There's also sometimes a mismatch between the expected outcomes from the capacity development programs and the capacities or the competencies required to achieve those outcomes. And that's mainly sort of internal to Swedish government agencies. And that's what Richard referred to as sort of building their own capacity in the first place, or using some of the core funding to do that. So there is sort of very much sort of an agreement on this. On a more general level, systems thinking and multi-stakeholder more and more imperative in this kind of cooperation, where twinning peer-to-peer is important at one scale and one level. That much sort of bigger resolution or bigger scale keeps on sort of coming up in evaluations and studies. And that's simply because development processes are societal changes. So what happens within an organization both mirrors and reflects and is reflected back on the societal changes, whether you are working in a well-established sort of country or you're working in a post-conflict or a new state, for example, like Kosovo. We also kind of concur with and agree that systems change are beyond a single intervention. Sometimes there is this expectation that or kind of laying over expectation on one project or one program to effect the kind of change that realistically is beyond sort of one intervention to do. And that kind of leads us to the last point, that the business model of sort of development cooperation should be compatible sort of and aligned with the principles of system thinking. And that kind of takes us slightly into kind of a new paradigm. We have three sort of, I'll conclude with three pointing sort of directions that our study came up with, and we were sort of quite pleased that this kind of also aligned with this evaluation. From the Swedish government agencies' perspective, they need more directives with sort of associated core funding, as in a more coherent and sort of an all-inclusive dialogue between all the agencies and CEDES and the Foreign Ministry, rather than sort of a bilateral and one-to-one. There are already sort of forums to achieve that, and I'm sure Karin will reflect on this, but there was that sense that these needs to be kind of further strengthened and boosted, and that dialogue to kind of take far more sort of center stage. To SIDA and the Swedish government networks, guidance and support mechanisms, especially where there are sort of lack of expertise and where they should get it from, whether they are internal or external. And finally, to the Swedish government agencies themselves, they need to revisit their internal messaging about why they are engaged in capacity development work internationally. Some of them are very clear on that. Some of them, they still question why they're being mandated with this. Longer inception phases, of course, that allow for careful sort of contextual analysis, trust, and building relationships, as it said. So in all, I think we found ourselves kind of moving more or less totally independent from each other, but at the same time finding that studies that were initiated at different times, driven by different purposes, had different scopes, still kind of somewhat converged into the same findings, some of which provide strength to what we know already from the literature, while others are new and sort of opened our eyes to issues that we need to pay a lot more attention to.
Thank you, Mo. And I agree. It's interesting to see how two different studies from different perspectives actually converge like this in conclusions and to some extent also in recommendations. It will now be interesting to hear a view from a centrally placed source at SIDA, Karin. I will introduce to you Karin Metel-Cueva. She is the head of Capacity Development Unit at SIDA. She has more than 20 years experience in the development field. She has worked with the Swedish government, with the UN, and with private sector consultancies. Prior to taking up her present position, Karin served as an advisor mainly in the area of public administration and public financial management, and she has worked extensively in Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa. She's an economist by training from Stockholm University, and Karin, it's good to hear your comment from a SIDA perspective now. Over to you.
Thank you, Magnus, and thank you, Eba, for doing this very timely report that we've read with a lot of interest. I think also we've worked with Mo and Lund University together with the Swedish government agencies to really understand what are the constraints and what are the main the unique aspects of Swedish government agencies. I don't know if you mentioned, Magnus, but I am responsible for coordinating Swedish government agencies within SIDA and have done that for the past 4 years. And I think we have come, in the past years, we've come a long way to really build that relationship and trust that is needed in order to work more as a team. I think that Swedish government agencies are really a unique and important resource in Swedish development cooperation. This evaluation shows that they have been able to achieve very important results when it comes to institutional capacity, not always reaching as far as they could, and reaching having results in terms of benefits of the population, but sometimes it has. And what I think is very unique with this resource is that it's peer-to-peer, building on trust between equal partners. So that when a government agency comes to another government agency, they are sharing experiences and they are cooperating on the same level. And that's something that is quite unique in development cooperation and something that we as a bilateral donor should be very proud of, because it's something that other agencies can't really deliver. And it's not just the technical expertise that they have, but it's also the what's called the tacit knowledge of being a civil servant, knowing what it means to work in public sector administration, knowing what it means to work in a politically guided organization. That kind of knowledge is something that you can't acquire or can't just transfer, and what also can build the trust between these parties. So I think it's a very unique and important resource that we should develop and we should invest in. But I also think what this evaluation recognizes is that this capacity is not enough on its own, and we need to couple it with other type of resources. I think another very important finding that is not unique to this report is that ownership is very key to results. In the Western Balkans, EU accession has been a proxy of ownership. It's something that has driven development and something that has anchored some of the achievements that were done. In other contexts, we don't have the EU accession as a driving force. And we know from experience that having a strong ownership, meaning an identified problem that the recipient, if you want to use that word, really feels is urgent to solve, it could be a signal of ownership, not an external outsider saying this is the best practice that we should use, or this is how we do it in Sweden or elsewhere, but really identifying a problem that is urgent and then trying to find the ways that can solve it in the local context. And local context and knowledge about the local context has also been underlined in this report and by the work of Lund University as well. And it's something that we need to invest more in, and again, helps the Swedish agencies understand and give them time to work with. Another important factor that this report highlights is the importance of working in a system-wide approach. And I fear that we we'll use this term as something without really identifying what do we mean. There are some good examples in the report where several institutions have worked with different parts of the delivery chain, for example. But I think systems-wide approach is even more complicated sometimes, because institutional capacity really requires systems thinking. You really need to see what are the actors involved, who is this government agency interacting with. So it's the citizens, it's civil society, it's private sector sometimes, and it's really a big ask for a government agency to understand and to work with that very complex system. And that's also why the report, I think, recommends SIDA and the embassies to help the government agencies in that respect. There is also the recommendations that we should work as Team Sweden and have mixed delivery teams, which I think is a very good recommendation. And that requires us at SIDA to recognize that working with a government agency is more working as a team, not working with another partner that is accountable to us, but working as a team where we do one part, the government agencies does another part, and we can find other external resources. But it's a quite resource-intense way of working. And so far, I think resources hasn't been abundant at embassy level. So if you look at it very practically, it's often easier to choose another implementing partner that is more fit for purpose, perhaps, or has more of the available capacities, but it loses then the edge of the Swedish experience, or what we as a country can offer. So finally, I just want to say that we've now heard some of these recommendations for a long time. We've worked in tandem. We have built up the trust and the knowledge and experience between SIDA and the government agencies. And I think we have finally reached a point where we feel that there is also a lot of political support and drive for strengthening this type of institutional capacity building. And we will, as of next year, have a much stronger focus and much more resources to work with Swedish government agencies. So some of the recommendations in this study comes very timely, and I'm really looking forward to being able to develop that work even further with more resources, both at headquarters and at the embassies. So thank you.
Thank you, Karin. And from an EBA perspective, it's very encouraging to hear that the recommendations are timely and well taken care of. We have also asked two representatives from Swedish government authorities to join us in this discussion. They have been part of, they have been reviewed in this evaluation, and it's only fair to hear their perspective. We have Stefan Andersson here. He is the head of the International Cooperation Office of Statistics Sweden. Prior to taking up his position in 2018, he has been working in the area of development cooperation for a number of years in different fields. In Sweden, he has mainly worked at the headquarters of SIDA, where he has held positions such as lead specialist and advisor on result-based management. We have also Ulrik Westman with us. He is heading the international unit of the Swedish Environmental Protection Agency. He was previously working at the International Secretariat at the Ministry of Environment in Sweden, and prior to that at UN Habitat based in Nairobi. And he's a town planning architect by training. I will start with you, Stefan. From your perspective, from Statistics Sweden, do you think this evaluation does justice to Statistics Sweden's peer-to-peer cooperation in the Western Balkans?
Well, the short-hand answer would be yes, but with some qualifications. I think one has to bear in mind that this is really a snapshot of our vast cooperation. Currently, we're having 14 projects ongoing throughout the world, where 4 are in the Balkans. And over probably the last half decade or so, there has been a stronger emphasis on change management and also overall business models with our partners and so on. So with that sort of little qualifications, I would say it gives justice to our work, and it also in a very good way portrays the challenges we are encountering in our work. And also alluding to what Mo was saying, it corresponds very well with other studies, the conversations we're having with Karen and her unit at SIDA, who's being the main counterpart for this kind of cooperation. And it also fits well with the sort of gut feelings we've been having about our own our challenges and so on. So I will focus on 3 of the lessons learned in the report: the systems-wide approach, quality and presence of resident long-term experts, and on the inception phase and quality of design. And then I will just briefly touch upon our own business development work we're undertaking right now. So when we begin with the systems-wide approach, it is indeed challenging to work with that. As everyone has been saying before, basically our work is premised on a peer-to-peer approach, where statisticians and experts on communication and dissemination of statistics and so on work hand in hand with the counterparts. And transitioning beyond that is really sometimes challenging. Nevertheless, I would say that we do have a systems approach in our current portfolio. In statistics, for example, you have what you call a national statistical system, where all the different government agencies and ministries collecting, producing, and disseminating statistics make up that's the system. And for example, in Sweden, you have 28 different actors within that system. So our sister agency, the National Statistical Institute of a given country, makes up the counterpart, and that's the starting point for our work. So in practice then, for us, I may have the answer to Karen here, the system-wide approach for us is really working together with our partner in their system to make them include all the relevant stakeholders in that system, and that could be ministries, central banks, civil society organizations, so on, that are users of statistics, and also multilateral development partners, bilateral level partners, and so on. However, one has to bear in mind that we should not build separate structures. We have to work through our partner. Like right now, for example, in Albania, where we are helping our partner work with their users, setting up statistical literacy programs and having training programs for the statistical users in the country. And we're doing the same thing in Cambodia, for example, where our partner is working with the Ministry of Finance. And also a side effect of that is that the NSI brand within that context against the ministries is improved. So we provide our support based on our unique competence. We're the expert agency on developing and producing and disseminating statistics, and also coordinating the Swedish statistical system. But if you want a systems-wide approach that goes beyond that, I think it's really alluding to what some of the interventions have been saying. It's really part of the strategy portfolio management of SIDA and the embassies that this holistic approach should be taken. Like, for example, in Cambodia, where our project is part and parcel of a public financial management reform program. There, by program design, you really have the systems approach. I also fully recognize our work when it comes to the quality and presence of long-term advisors. It's really an important element to have the long-term experts on location. And it was really pronounced now when we repatriated some of them during the Corona situation, or they're still ongoing. I may not be that fond of the term quality of long-term experts, but I think it's about really equipping the posted task with a purpose, with a fit-for-purpose skill set, rather than looking at the individuals as such. And we should reduce the element of chance in that is portrayed in the report. And also, finally, when it comes to the identification of inception phases and the quality of design as a success factor, we really recognize ourselves in that one as well. We have come to the same conclusion. That's what we bring into the table now with SIDA. It would also I will finish, Magnus. That would also address some of the other key success factors, allowing for more systems-wide approach, setting up management teams, and really getting immersed into the context and so on. So I'll stop short there. We really recognize ourselves. It's a valuable input to our own business development.
Thank you, Stefan. It's good to hear that you find that the report is useful also from your perspective. Ulrich, over to you then. Do you think that this report gives an accurate picture of your work and the challenges you face?
Well, thank you, Magnus, and thanks for inviting me. Well, the short answer would be yes. I believe it does to a large degree. And I think Stefan framed it quite well in his intervention just now, so I won't repeat those messages. And in fact, it's been very interesting to listen to the comments made by Mo and Karin and Stefan. I mean, your words of wisdom makes me proud of being a Swedish government official. So thanks. And I'm also, of course, very glad to see that the EBA is producing this type of evaluations. I hope it will take us a few steps further in understanding how to best contribute to high quality of governance worldwide. So I really think it will. I hope so. And well, I'm convinced that the global challenges that we are facing, such as climate change and biodiversity loss and different types of pollution, I mean, really requires capable and reliable and accountable institutions in every country on this planet. The market won't really be able to regulate on its own, and the free will of the average consumer is also, of course, far from enough. So I'm a strong believer in the importance of well-functioning institutions, and especially when it comes to states' abilities to deliver welfare and sustainable development at scale. But now, looking at the report, in its conclusion, it refers to a unique relationship of trust between peers, and we've heard it from Karin and others. And I'd like to dwell a bit on this and highlight the importance of trust and openness when it comes to our international cooperation. And as you know, it takes quite some time to establish trust, and you have to earn it. And unfortunately, it can rather easily be lost or at least be severely damaged. And we are, as you also know, dealing with individuals, even though we have the ambition to develop capacity at an institutional and system-wide scale, we keep on coming back to its core, meaning the individual. And that's really where the peer-to-peer exchange ultimately takes place, which is also where our weaknesses and personal features becomes obvious for good and for bad. But often, to my experience, the more we get to know each other, also in a more private manner, trust increases. And with trust, communication runs much more smoothly, and you might be more keen to open up, to explore new approaches of running government operations, for example. So one shouldn't really underestimate the importance of establishing trust, and also accept that it will require time and patience to establish, and not least to maintain trust in our bilateral relations. So if I have a little bit more time, I'd like to also mention the importance of allowing the reality to truly influence project implementation. I believe this is partly reflected in the recommendation to CEDA and SGAs in the report, and we've received quite positive feedback because of our ability and willingness to adapt. We couldn't have done this without the strong support by CEDA and the colleagues at the embassy. By understanding the local challenges, adapting to the actual needs, that's when you gain trust, and also you will be more likely to deliver on the most relevant topics in the local context. And another aspect is the co-creation and learning taking place in our projects. I'd like to mention the Network for Learning, for example, which is of great help. It inspires team members and colleagues across agencies to explore new and hopefully more efficient ways of doing business. And at the Swedish EPA, we've been quite active in establishing the Network for Learning over the past 10 years or so, but it hasn't always been easy to prioritize. So it's great to see that SIDA is now more and more getting back into the work and truly supporting SGAs with the network. So thanks, Karin and SIDA, for your active engagement on this. And I think I'll stop there for now. Thanks.
Thank you, Ulrich, and thank you for bringing up the learning across agencies where experiences can actually be shared and lessons learned. Now, Richard, it's time, I think, for you to reflect on the reflections. You've heard a lot of comments and suggestions from Mo, Karin, Stefan, and Ulrich. Any reflections from your part?
Well, thanks, Magnus. I mean, first of all, I'm extremely pleased to hear just how how well our kind of findings have kind of resonated. I think with particularly Mo's findings from his research and his team's research, and with the realities that SIDA and the SGAs are facing. So I'm obviously pleased that this is something that's been helpful. A couple of points just struck me, and I think obviously we could have made more of this in the report. But I think Stefan's point about where is the location for the design, the initiation and the design of interventions, and I think this his emphasis that this is a team approach. This isn't the responsibility of one agency. This is about the Swedish embassy, about the Swedish government authorities and others, and the government co-creating and working together to understand what are the priorities, what are the problems, and how do we resolve them. And it's not up to the Swedish government agencies alone to deal with this. I think bringing in other resources and the examples he's been giving were particularly useful, I think, at this point. I think that's a very important theme that's coming through, I think, from everyone's comments. I think the one of the key things I've been wrestling with, I think, is also something that Stefan highlighted, which is, what do we expect from the Swedish government authorities? What can we reasonably expect from them? Clearly, we want their core competencies, their expertise as statisticians, as land surveyors, as police, as environmental experts. Clearly, that's what we want. But we're also putting a big demand, when we're looking at what's successful and what works, we're putting a big demand on additional skills, on change management skills, on diplomacy, on understanding political economy. That's a big ask, and I don't know how realistic that is to demand and expect that from the Swedish government authorities. And how realistic is it for them to invest in developing those skills? Or how then, if those are necessary, how do we then bring them into that team for the analysis and for the delivery of these interventions? And I think that's quite that's a question that I keep asking myself when I have these discussions. And I think the third point that was raised, I think, is also a very important one, which is, we recognize, and I think everyone recognizes, that system-wide approach is, ideal, because governments do have these interdependencies. But it does put a great burden on those people who are working in there to understand how the system works. It can be very complicated because it's not just formal, visible stuff. I think Mo was mentioning his talk, the social contract, the implicit understandings about how things really work. That needs to be understood as well. And so there's a lot more that's going on. And I think, our recommendation about the inception phase is maybe a bit glib, because what's really needed is that much deeper level of understanding, that deeper level of trust and openness in order to come up with real viable solutions. And that's massively complicated. And I think, kudos to all the agencies who've managed to achieve that so far. I think they've done a fantastic job.
Thank you, Richard. Your last words of something being massively complicated is really is a good trigger for a good discussion, isn't it? And we are now going to have a discussion in this panel of sorts, where I think we should drill down on a few of the success factors you identify, and we have all alluded to them during this discussion so far. But before we talk about actual success, perhaps we should reflect a bit on the concept of capacity itself. Because I think that the report reminds us that capacity is really like potential, isn't it? I mean, it's completely useless unless you put that capacity into productive use. And for this type of peer-to-peer cooperation, we really talk about results in a way in three different levels, don't we? We talk about the individual skills, the skills of the individual. We talk about professional capacity, and then we talk about the organizational ability to deliver on its mandate, the performance of the organization itself. And for any successful peer-to-peer cooperation, you need actually to climb that ladder in order to, and that becomes increasingly complicated the more, and you require more and more a variety of competencies that are not necessarily easy to find within that your particular host agency. I see a vigorous nod from your corner, Stefan, and you can be the first one on this one.
Thank you, Magnus. And also thank you, Richard, for being able to synthesize what I was saying in a more comprehensible way. So thanks for that. No, but any obvious starting point when it comes to capacity development would be sort of the individual skills of someone to have the ability to perform certain tasks and so on. Quite often not quite often, but we always run the risk of staying there, right? And confusing capacity development with competence development and so on. But if we start with individual, the staff from our agency would, for example, train their peers for traditional training on transfer of knowledge, exchange of experience, and so on in, for example, statistical methodology and the quality concept within statistical methodology and so on, or the whole process of undertaking a statistical survey to disseminating statistics and so on, and thereby through it processing it and so on. But then we shouldn't stop short there. Ideally, we should then use some sort of classic training of trainers concept, where they are then in turn able to train their colleagues. And then we're starting to move towards the sort of organizational ability level. And with our support, then our peers should also develop their own training material, which is tailored to their context, that meets the needs of their colleagues and so on. And then we may add on our HR department that sets up a full training program for our sister organization. That should make our sister organization more of a learning organization, where you have a long-term sustainable supply of competence within that organization, where you can, within that organization, have a transfer of knowledge and so on. Then there is also in statistics what you call the generic statistical business process model, which is really a standardized method all the way, including quality management for producing and then disseminating statistics, including also looking into the needs of the users of the statistics. Because I mean, the statistics are not they're virtually useless unless they're being used. Then you could have, for example, then train other actors within the national statistical system. It could be in a devolved system, the counties, like in Kenya, for example. It could be the ministries, like the example I was mentioning before in Cambodia and Albania. And it could be then training in terms of statistical literacy, so that the users of the statistics can understand what these statistics can be used for, and also in the future make demands and specify what their needs are in the future development of the system. I'll stop short there on the chain from the individual up to the systems level.
Thank you, Stefan. And I think it illustrates the difficulty from the experts of a Swedish agency to actually have that full chain, because you're not necessarily equipped for change management just because you're an excellent statistical expert. Ulrich, I guess from your perspective, you must have experienced similar challenges.
Absolutely. And again, Stefan put it quite nicely. He explained it quite nicely. But indeed, yes, capacity development tends to expand. There is no upper boundaries in a way. So I guess that's a constant discussion we're having. I mean, where should we have our boundaries in this co-development process? Because we don't exist in a vacuum. We have lots of tasks back home where we have to deliver. So we have, of course, ourselves limited capacities. And we are a small player in a huge sector. So we need to be quite careful with what type of capacity we put into the equation. And I think that there was actually a question from Joachim Molander about the importance of partner ownership and then how it can lead to political support. And I think it relates a little bit to this because it belongs in the same package. Like, for example, in Bosnia, we try to work on air quality management, and it's a lot about data management to make the data public, of course. And the intention is to improve on the debate, on the dialogue within civil society and between politicians. And we see that it's happening. And it is, in fact, thanks to the fact that we build capacity, how to manage air quality data and communicate about that data. So I think that's a good example, actually.
One of the experiences we had at the Swedish National Audit Office in our peer-to-peer cooperation was that the technical competence in our partner organization tend to be higher and higher, and the standard technical training is getting more and more obsolete in a sense, and organizational and institutional development is more and more about connecting the professional dots into an ability for the organization, and that is basically a leadership issue and a management issue. And the challenge then being, how do you actually make sure that you involve the top leadership of your sister organization, and are you able to mobilize similar resources from your own organization to help peer your sister organizations? Any reflections from the panel on that? Karin, I see you are waving, so please. You need to unmute, yes.
I completely agree. I think sometimes the technical skills are as high or even higher in some of our partner organizations. And it's very often a matter of unleashing capacity and inspiring different ways of working, trying to have people talk to each other, a lot of change management. There was an interesting question in the chat also about from Joachim about political leadership, how you inspire innovative reforms that will really drive change. And I think looking outside or looking to other countries, be it Sweden or be it other peers, can be such an inspiration, or even competing with other countries, trying to look how others have done. So it could definitely be a way. But one of the aspects missing a little bit from our Swedish development cooperation, I would say, is the policy level. We have very good technical experts, but our Swedish government agencies, as you know, are very independent, very implementing policies, but not creating policies. And sometimes we would like to draw on policymakers in development cooperation. How did we do the budget reform of the 90s in Sweden? Or what's the challenges with the tax reform or something else? Or how do we tackle climate change? And that level has been very difficult to draw on, I would say. And it would be interesting if we could have if we could experiment with more of that also government and policy level in development cooperation.
Thank you, Karin. We are getting in some Q&As in the Q&A function. I will turn to you in a while. I think that one of the but before doing that, I'd like us to drill down a bit more in one of the success factors in the report. And that was, and you have alluded to most of you, I think, the longer inception phases, allowing time for this mutual understanding to develop and to be culturally sensitive. You, Mo, phrased it as the differences in the national social contract. And how that difference in the social contract affects leadership styles and the role of the civil service, and that in turn will have knock-on effects on program conceptualization, development, design, and implementation. Mo, I know this is an issue that is close to your heart, but perhaps you could take the lead on that issue.
Sure, and I will qualify a couple of things that Ulrik and Stefan mentioned. If you look at how sort of capacity development in general was framed, we had the individual, organizational, and enabling environment kind of framing, and even kind of dividing these into kind of more kind of minute sort of levels. But there is another framing, which is the form, function, and legitimacy. So you create an organization in a certain form, and we had a tendency in the history of capacity development to create organizations that mirror our sort of type of organizations, but they don't function. And then we get past that, and we paid a lot of attention to functionality. So organizations actually function, and they have the capabilities that Karin sort of referred to, and in some cases, competencies that actually exceed ours sometimes. But then sometimes we actually get stuck a little bit in that sort of kind of glass ceiling sort of at the top, which is that legitimacy. So what Stefan said, organizations that produce the best statistics in the world, but if these statistics are not used in policy, or they don't find their way into parliament, for example, then what's the use of it? Now, this legitimacy issue is beyond, I think, what a single agency can do. So the position of that organization in society, how much it has influence, how much is kind of tied into the overall network of policymaking within the country, especially if it's a new one, if it's a new and nascent one, or one that had a very sort of low capacity before that. Now, when you get to that level, expecting a single program and a single Swedish agency to actually take it throughout this whole journey is sort of beyond the internal capacities that we have. Going back to what Richard sort of and Karin said, would you build that capacity inside one Swedish agency, the political economy, understanding that, doing the contextual analysis, all of that? Or would you actually have another mechanisms that brings a lot of sort of sister Swedish agencies together, the one that had perhaps more experience in that context before this particular one, that managed to kind of cross that threshold with sort of another sort of sister agency? It needs a different mechanism than doing it linearly and doing it in silos. Every program has to do this and has to take it sort of all the way sort of to that, to that sort of end of that journey. Because when you get to that point, there is a lot that really takes a long time to understand, even longer than just an inception phase. The obstacles could be extreme sort of societal changes that kind of surpasses the mandate of a single program. We take taxes, for example. If the country has a legacy of no taxation system, and suddenly you're asking people to pay taxes. Well, what are taxes are for? Well, what kind of, as a citizen and a duty towards government, what are you paying taxes for? If there is rife corruption, for example, and people are not confident that these taxes will find their way into sort of services back sort of returned at them. And you can see how different that is from the Swedish mindset. There are two certainties in Sweden: death and taxes. There's nothing else. So in other sort of societies, introducing that, and that's just kind of one example, or indeed in the environment sector, for example, why would you need to kind of to protect these sort of commons or communal resources when people have been plundering it sort of for a long time? What sort of model? So you need both in terms of, from the very beginning, as you said, conceptualization of that program that has an implication on the model that is used, that has an implication on the actual design of that program. And all of that has implications on the duration of it, the amount of funding that is required into it, the expertise that come into it within the single organization that's taking part, or sort of kind of beyond that. I mentioned something in the email to you, Magnus, that nothing shines more light on the social contract than the COVID crisis. You see how we responded in Sweden, you see how other countries responded, how appropriate it is to the social contract in that country, not just culturally, but that's reflected in almost everything that we do. Thank you, Mo.
There are many posted questions on the Q&A function. But before we let the audience in, I think this very issue of longer inception periods, ultimately it costs money, Karin, doesn't it? And being the back donor, there must be lessons for SIDA here.
Yes.
You are muted. Yeah.
Yes. I think it costs money, but also doing the wrong things or doing things not well enough is also very costly. We have worked for a while with design support for Swedish government agencies, because they don't have resources to invest of their own, and in order to enable them to work with the inception, with the trust building, and really getting to know the partners. We call it design support to establish that. But I also said once that I think almost the whole project should be an inception phase, which could sound a bit provocative, but I think that really entails the adaptive management that we don't know from the outset, and we continuously learn while we work. So we have to be able to adjust what we said initially we were going to do, and then learn and readjust and stay focused on what we wanted to achieve, but change the way we get there. So in a way, adaptive management is really an inception phase all along.
Thanks, Karin. I will now let the audience in. There are many questions waiting for your comments in the panel. The first question is from Joachim Molander. He says, you have mentioned the importance of partner ownership and political support. However, sometimes an expert agency needs to drive innovative reforms with the purpose of achieving political changes eventually. Have you seen examples of this happening? Is peer-to-peer capacity development a good tool for contributing to such change? Any takers on the panel for that tricky question? Political change and peer-to-peer cooperation. Richard.
Yeah, if I may tackle that one. I mean, it's quite a stretch to try and tackle that, but I think there are two things. I wouldn't want to say that a Swedish government agency would come in with the explicit aim of achieving political change. I think that shouldn't be the intention. I would say rather that the Swedish government agencies and the Swedish government in general can stimulate and inspire change. And we've certainly seen examples of that happening. I think when you see, the reference point in terms of long inception phases is the Swedish land agency's experience in Bosnia, where the aim of the inception phase was in fact to not just to examine the problems, but also to inspire solutions. And something that's been alluded to by other panel members has been the study visits, the visits to other countries, see what it looks like in practice. What are the solutions? And I think the inception phase can help build political commitment to a solution, and not just say let's just deal with this problem. And I think once you have political commitment to a visible, understandable, shared understanding of what that solution looks like, then you can drive quite a lot of change forward, or at least support a lot of change forward. But the driving force definitely stays with the host government and not with the Swedish government agency.
But isn't there sometimes, I think it was you, Karin, who said that EU accession is a proxy for ownership sometimes, and there is a sort of reform package that some countries are a bit reluctant actually to pursue aggressively. And I guess that an implicit argument from a donor point of view could be that by promoting reform agents or making reform agents more professional and more working according to international standards and what have you, you can actually build a momentum for reform and for political change that otherwise wouldn't be there.
If I may?
Yes, you may.
I agree. I think, EU accession is, if it's not really a drive or something that the country wants to achieve, then it's not going to work as a motivator, and I really think ownership means that you have defined the problem that you want to see solved, as I said in my previous intervention. I think one of the things that government agencies can do very well and that we are good at in Sweden is really to build on evidence, working with evidence, statistics, what we have, and then try to convince policymakers. And I've seen many examples of that happening. And it's something that we are quite good at promoting as well. Thanks.
There is a comment from Jenny Ekelberg saying that partners often want to see action and results quickly and not allow for 1 year's inception. How do you balance the need for planner and proper inception phases with the need to have sort of expectations to deliver results quickly? The need for low-hanging fruits, I guess. Is there anyone who sort of would recognize this situation of an eagerness? Stefan, are you?
I'm unmuting, so I'm sort of ready to pick it up. I think I got the question. I couldn't see it, but I was trying to listen attentively. Now we are right now, as part of our sort of new model for statistical capacity development, bringing that to the table in the dialogue with the embassies and SIDA in new corporations, that we want to have this kind of inception phase. It's would allow, instead of having very definitely defined programs already from day one, where there would be this pressure to deliver fairly swiftly on certain tangible results and so on. A bit more, how should I word it? Slightly more loose-knit programs, where you, after a certain period of time, say half a year or so, would and then we would place our long-term expert or resident advisor on location during that time, that would allow to work closely with our counterpart further developing it, ensuring ownership, or at least gauging ownership, whether there is real ownership from a partner organization or on the higher level or on their principal ministry and so on. So we are bringing that into the equation now, and we having what we haven't seen the proof of it yet, but we think it's going to be very instrumental in reaching success. And then in the dialogue with the embassies, of course, it's very important we have a very transparent dialogue about expectations. Okay, so we have this inception phase. What can you expect at the end of that? And then you would bring together a more firm results framework, but then coupled with a more, how do you say, doing development differently, outcome harvesting based model for monitoring and evaluation and so on, moving along, being explicit about that this is not necessarily the results framework we will look at 3-4 years from now, but this is what we arrive at together with our partner at this point in time.
Thank you, Stefan. I saw Mo, you were waving your hand. May I ask the panel to be short in the answers? We have a lot of questions from the floor. So Mo?
I don't think these are mutually exclusive, to deliver results early on and have an inception phase at the same time. And I think that's due to the uniqueness of the Swedish model itself, particularly coming from SIDA, that the inception phase is part of the project or part of the program, rather it kind of precedes the program. It's kind of funded within that. And it enables and allows those co-creation, co-design processes. That was evident in a couple of programs at Naturvårdsverket at the Swedish Environment Protection Agency. Ulrich, of course, can reflect on the EGP program, where it involved sort of all the stakeholders in the actual design, seeing that as part of delivering results. There is an inherent capacity development in that process itself, in kind of how you design sort of a program. But you can sort of piggyback a lot of sort of quick results at the same stage. It was also evident in even our kind of small study that Jenny Yao Jorgensen led with SIDA, with Karen, with the Network for Learning, on how we were able to kind of design the actual study with the people who the study were aimed at. There was a lot seen that there is sort of value in that as well. So instead of kind of being linear in that sense and constantly chasing low-hanging fruit, that actually leads to kind of very episodic and sort of kind of very piecemeal results. But doing that, and at the same time seeing the value in the inception phase as a capacity development component in program design, that I don't see them as mutually exclusive at all.
Thank you, Mo. There is a question from the embassy in Sarajevo, and I think this is directed to you, Richard. I do believe we need, from Torgny Svenningsson in Sarajevo, I do believe we need a close and co-creative relation with Swedish agencies, and they need a stable planning horizon to build up internal capacity. On the other hand, we must emphasize host country ownership and demand. Could there be a risk of offering support of what Sweden can supply, but maybe host countries don't demand? That's for you, Richard.
Hi. Well, I mean, it's an extremely good question. I think, clearly there's a lot of enthusiasm, from the Swedish side to offer solutions. But I do think that comes back to, a lot of what we've been discussing about this inception phase. I think then, but there needs to be, from the Swedish side, there needs to be the willingness to abandon or to stop an intervention if there really is no political will. And that's quite tough, because I think, there's not, once you've committed yourself to something, do you really have the license to say, actually, no, we're not going to do it because we don't think there's enough political will here? But that comes back to, I think, maybe what we haven't included in our report is actually using the terms, adaptive management. But I think that's really it. It's really saying, let's adapt what we're doing. Let's allow ourselves to change, to stop, to adjust, to take a breather if the condition's not right on the ground. And obviously that comes into quite conflict with sort of bureaucratic procedures and requirements, and there's always this tension, I think, when you're trying to be adaptive when it comes to sort of the administrative side, the bureaucratic side of aid.
Karin, I saw you indicated you wanted to say something.
Very briefly, I think it was a very good question, and that is also partly why I'm a bit hesitant about the core funding recommendation. That having core funding to a number of agencies, we have 250 government agencies, by the way, in Sweden, could be a bit of a supply-driven approach, which we don't want to see. We want really to see a demand-driven approach. Otherwise, I steal a line from my Norwegian colleagues, which is, we don't offer solution, we share experiences. And that's a good one, I think.
That is very true, Karin. There are a couple of questions regarding the width of the recommendations, and in the report, Richard, you make a reservation that this is the Western Balkans. We have a particular situation with EU accession on the horizon, and that gives leverage to a lot of the reform initiatives. And the question then is, what can be learned from the study, especially in more challenging contexts than the Balkans, with weaker institutions where a legitimate basis of government authority is contested? Because this is the Western Balkans with its characteristics. Are there any generic lessons from this that you could draw, potentially draw in other contexts?
I mean, I guess I should leave that question really to the people who work. I tend to work mostly in the Western Balkans, so I don't have that sort of broad view. I mean, I would say a couple of things. I mean, I think EU accession is not the big driver that it should be, and certainly we see in areas like justice reform in some countries where the governments are just not interested. Anti-corruption efforts, they're just not interested, and so you cannot. It doesn't matter, what you do. You're not going to achieve any change. And I suppose that's the sort of thing that we can pick up on in terms of applying to other contexts. But there are signals, you do see signals from agencies, partner agencies, where, it's clear that there is political commitment. It's not, I don't think that's not something that's unique to the Western Balkans. You can see a politician or a head of an agency has interest and is acting on something, and then you can work with that. And I think that would be the same everywhere. It's just the EU accession context is coupled also with a higher level of development, a stronger civil service, and so it makes it slightly easier, I think, to accomplish solutions and to work properly system-wide. But maybe the others who've worked in other contexts would be better placed, I think, to answer some of this question.
Stefan and Ulrich, do you have any takeaways that you believe would be generic in that sense? Yes, Stefan?
Okay, thank you. Sorry if I got ahead of you, Ulrich. No, but I mean, the very simple answer to that question is that I think that the findings of the report is generic enough to also apply for our portfolio at large. When it comes to leaving aside the Chapter 18 and the EU statistics acquis and so on, when it comes to the findings in terms of capacity development, the recommendations and so on, I would say that applies across our portfolio. And as I said briefly before, we're having 14 projects ongoing right now. And we have projects from Guatemala to Mali, regional Africa on migration statistics. We have in Bangladesh, and then now in Cambodia, and then we have in the Western Balkans also. We have bilateral and regional ones. And I would say, without going into the details, this one provides valuable insights into the work we're doing right now in sort of conceptualizing the way we work and the way we want to work. And I'm glad that you mentioned adaptive management, Richard, because that's one of the leitmotifs in our the model we have now developed for ourselves. So yes, it gives valuable insights to also for other parts in the world.
Thank you, Stefan. I see you are nodding, Ulrich, but you are now unmuted.
Agree. Stefan framed it quite nicely, and I can only agree that this will hopefully help us to improve the way we do business globally, not only in this particular region, but I think there's a lot that we will continue to discuss in my team, in our team, on how we can improve the way we do business.
There was also a question from Isabel Berglund asking if there is any specific preparation that Swedish government agencies need to do in order to make sure that their experts are well trained and knowledgeable on EU accession details. Perhaps Karin, could you comment on that one? Is this something that you feel that experts? We are now running out of time, so please be short.
Well, I think this is definitely a spot where we are weak. We don't provide a lot of training, and the agencies themselves don't always have the means or the resources to provide a lot of training. And it's something where we have a lot of, we could have possibilities of scale if we do it together. And we will, with more resources, we will definitely take on this challenge or this opportunity. So it's a welcome recommendation.
Thank you, Karin. I must apologize to all those who have posted questions and comments, and they have not been answered. I have tried to summarize some of your questions. This seminar is drawing to a close. I would like to thank the panel, Richard, Mo, Ulrich, Stefan, and Karin for your valuable comments and for sharing your insights. I hope you all feel that the discussion we have had did justice to the report. I would encourage everyone listening to actually read the full report, at least the main report. This seminar was just a teaser. The other reports can be downloaded from and all other reports can be downloaded from the EBA's webpage, www.eba.se. You have a lot of previous EBA reports to download on that website as well. I think I can guarantee that whatever your special interest is, there will be something for you among those reports. On that webpage, you can also sign up to our newsletter. The next EBA seminar will be on trust-based management in development cooperation, a very interesting topic, and the seminar will take place on the 28th of October. And then probably in November, there will be another seminar on another report on sextortion as a form of corruption and gender-based violence. Also a very highly interesting topic. If you haven't already, make sure you listen to our podcasts where we bring up news from reports we have just released. Having said that, I would just like to thank everyone in the audience and the panel. It remains to close this seminar, and I wish you welcome back at a future EBA event. Bye for now.